Well, it's a great pleasure to have Arthur Sinodinos on the yarn today. Now, Arthur and I served together in the Australian Senate, and he's been a good friend for many years. And of course, most recently, he has been Australia's ambassador to the United States. So, g'day, Arthur.
Hey, mate. Good to be with you.
So, we all want to know what's your take on the election or re-election, I should say, of Mr. Donald Trump?
Thanks, mate. I think the first thing to say is something John Howard used to say, which is the mob never gets it wrong. In other words, an election is an election. If it's won fair and square, as it was in this case, then you accept the result and you work out, well, okay, why did a plurality of people vote for Donald Trump? And I think there are a number of reasons. The economy is very important, the cost of living, inflation, immigration. The system was clearly out of control, and the Democrats only moved in the last year to try and bring things back under control. Cultural issues played a role as well. A lot of Americans who feel anxious. The society is changing very rapidly. The debates around even issues like trans, for example, got quite a bit of prominence. Became a bit of a lightning rod for these discussions around not just identity, but also, traditional values versus, changing perceptions of people and all the rest of it. There are a lot of people in the US who feel like outsiders. They haven't had a proper wage increase for a long time. 24% of people in states like Pennsylvania live paycheck to paycheck. So a lot of people felt like they weren't getting a fair shake, and the economic situation was making that worse. There's no doubt there would have been an element of some people voting against Kamala Harris because she was a female candidate, maybe even a racial element as well. But none of those were, if you like, paramount. What was paramount, I think, in particular, is that people wanted America to change. For the last 20 years, that indicator that we're familiar with, is the country going in the right direction, the wrong direction? Almost every election for the last 4 or 5 elections has been going in, people, a majority saying the country's going in the wrong direction. And that's presaged a change of administration. So in America, you've had several changes of administration in the last few years or the last decades or so, because people are feeling restless, anxious, and Trump was able to portray himself as the outsider. He doesn't do deals like those grubby politicians in Washington, D.C. He'll stand up for them. He'll give them a fair shake. And so he was the change candidate. And so in that sense, after the event in particular, you can explain the result. The big problem beforehand is always trying to predict the result, because, as you know, they don't have compulsory voting. So you've got to work out who's going to vote and what they're going to vote on.
So, what do you think he will actually do when it comes to the economy? Because this is one of the major things that can impact Australia.
Well, I mean, this is the big thing. It goes to his operating style. Will he live up to the promises that he's made around tariffs, for example, tax cuts? I think the main elements of his economic program he's very committed to. He once described tariff as the most beautiful word in the English language. So there'll be action on tariffs. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone will get a tariff increase. I think it'll be more selective and targeted. And we saw that with the recent pronouncements around Canada and Mexico and China. But there's no doubt he will use tariffs as a negotiating tool. Some people, like his Treasury Secretary designate, Scott Bessent, are trying to say, look, don't expect big increases in tariffs. They'll be more a negotiating tool which get people to the negotiating table. Now, he's the Treasury Secretary. I think he's trying to think about ways to contain the economic impact of this, because, as you know, having written on trade as you have, tariffs, the cost of tariffs is borne by consumers and your own industries that use tariffed inputs in the production process. So there are cost and inflation impacts potentially from that. If he's not able to fund his tax cuts, because he wants to extend the tax cuts that expire at the end of next year and make them bigger, including more corporate tax cuts. Now, that could have a big economic impact, but it could also have quite a big budgetary impact if he can't cover the cost. He thinks he can cover the cost with tariff increases and cuts in government spending. He's mentioned his Department of Government Efficiency. I think the most likely scenario is that you get further increase in debt and deficits, and that will have upward pressure on inflation and interest rates. Um, so I think the world is in for a rocky time on some of those economic indicators if he follows through on some of the proposals he's talking about. That said, if he cuts a lot of business regulation um, and streamlines government, that could have a good productivity inducing effect. The difference between a society or an economy like the US and Australia is that in the US, when they decide to change their settings, like they're all in, right? They make the adjustment, right? They rip the band-aid off and they get on with it. There's no such thing as the idea of safe change. Okay. You're either committed to the change or you're not. And so what I'm saying is the thing not to underestimate about the US economy is how it may respond to lower regulation and the fact that he's doubling down on energy production, including fossil fuels. Um, the crypto industry will get a big fillip. He is looking also to promote insurgency in the tech space. He and Musk and Peter Thiel, who's JD Vance's big mentor and supporter, they're not enamored of big tech. So there may be further action in terms of antitrust against big tech. Uh, but they're certainly in favor of tech more broadly being promoted. So you could have some really interesting supply side effects coming through, and maybe to some extent they counteract the impact on demand of some of his tax and tariff policies.
So, in terms of the tariff concept, the idea, as I understand it, is he wants to have better terms of trade on a bilateral basis with many countries. So, in terms of the relationship with Australia, I mean, that's already in a pretty strong position from his point of view, isn't it?
But look, we've got a free trade agreement with the US. We run a trade deficit with the US. So, in effect, we're not screwing them. You could say the reverse using his logic, but we won't go there. But the point is, last time around, because we were a close ally and because we were in deficit, I don't think he saw us as being particularly in the firing line. That's why when he did stuff on steel and aluminium imports, for example, Australia got a special deal which helped assuage some of the impact of what he was going to do. So Australia is not one of his main targets here. I mean, China is certainly a target. Canada and Mexico are targets to some degree. And also, I think he'll use it with some countries in Asia in particular, but China is the big one. Yeah, it's interesting. It's possible he will take further action against the Europeans, argue that we let European cars into the US, but it's not as easy for etc. And don't forget, we've been trying to get an EU free trade deal done for the last few years. A lot of protectionism in Europe. They may well respond to increased tariffs if it's more general across the board with their own protectionist measures. So you could have potentially a bit more of a global trade conflict, if you like. But the challenge is for the Europeans that their economy is in a real hole and they need some fairly drastic structural reform measures going forward.
So, Arthur, you're one of the few Australians that's worked personally with Donald Trump. What is his personal style like when you work with him?
Look, I mainly dealt with him in a formal sort of setting, so not necessarily watching him informally, sort of whatever. But he asks a lot of questions. That's his way of eliciting information. He's not necessarily a great reader. If you give him a big briefing book, he'll just sort of, I think his style from when he was in private business is very much get the people in who will brief me. He asks questions. It's a bit like the Socratic method, and that's how he elicits information. And look, he's a smart guy. He's no slouch. He always knows what he's looking for. He also has a good capacity to understand people, and he's very good at honing in on the vulnerability people may have. So I think he's a lot more insightful than perhaps people give him credit. Um, I think he encourages a bit of contestation when it comes to advice from people around him. I don't think he likes the idea of being dominated by one or two people giving advice. Uh, he also relies a lot on his own intuition, and a lot of this is mediated through how things impact on him. So if he feels that he's been disrespected, he'll react accordingly. That all plays into it. Look, we're all human beings. People have this to a greater or lesser degree. I think it's sort of a lot of these characteristics are magnified in someone like him. He's in a situation now where he feels he's got absolute power. He's got the Senate, he's got the House, he's got the popular vote, he's got the Electoral College. The Supreme Court is, to him, appears largely on side. For the next couple of years at least, he will act like someone who has absolute power. And he's already showing with his pronouncements, even before he becomes president, how he's impacting on the global economy and global politics.
So I guess then a lot of Australians will be wondering what's going to happen with these boats, these submarines. This is a significant investment. Clearly, the president-elect has been empowered to make the final call. How do you think that will play out?
Well, we people claim that he's a supporter of AUKUS. We haven't heard that from him himself, and we won't until after he's president and has had a chance to look at things like the defense budget. Because the challenge the US has got is to get its own submarine industrial base into shape so it can deliver the 2+ subs a year that are necessary to make sure that they meet their own targets, as well as being able to provide for us to get Virginia class submarines in the early 2030s. So I suspect at some stage the deal will be reviewed. The speculation here has been that whether he asked for a better deal, for example, we're putting $3 billion in US into the US industrial base. He may say, well, we need to accelerate production here. You can help us by putting in more. That's a possibility. And obviously we'd have to look at that. That would be a challenge for our defense budget, but there's pressure on our defense budget to go up anyway.
But you sound quite confident that this will work out.
On AUKUS,
Yeah, and the boats.
well, I think if it's framed in the context of being able to supplement the resources available to allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific to counter China, and the role that we can play there is another source of supply of submarines in that context, I think we can be pretty confident of it. People like Marco Rubio, who's about to become Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor designate, they're all supporters of measures to counter China, and they're aware of the work that's been done in the Congress to get AUKUS through, including the reforms to export controls and trafficking in arms regulations. There's a lot of support for AUKUS in the Congress, and I think that will flow through to the president and his team.
So I think the general view, from what I can see from Washington, has been that Mr. Rudd was able to do a good job in working with the Congress. Is that right?
Yeah. Kevin worked on the trafficking in arms regulations, the export controls, to help get all of that through, and that will streamline us being able to cooperate with the US and the UK on transfer of tech and information, and make our systems more interchangeable.
So it really is, having been an ambassador to the US, it really is this is a horrible term, but it is a Team Australia approach, isn't it? When you're working in the US.
That's the only way it works. That's right. Yeah, including both having Austrade there and what they do to promote trade and investment, working with the state trade and investment offices that are over here in the US, um, and the embassy itself is Team Australia. The ambassador, even though he's paid by DFAT, represents the Australian government. I was there. Kevin is there in a whole of government position, and most of the government portfolios from back home are represented at the embassy.
And so What do you think will happen in terms of the any pressure that might be put on Mr. Rudd from the new administration? I mean, firstly, maybe I should ask you: do you think that there will be pressure based on some of the historical comments, or will they be more likely to sort of move on?
I think the president himself, as he made clear in that Nigel Farage interview, um, he wasn't so much thinking about the past, but if people transgress in the future, they'll be in his firing line. Um, I think the challenge for Kevin is just to develop productive relationships with people in the White House, the State Department, Defense. He's already trying to do that. So time will tell how all of that will go. Um, they would have looked pretty weak and sort of a bit silly for Australia to just automatically withdraw their ambassador in Washington because of a change in administration. And I know there's all the toing and froing about what's been said in the past. Um, but lots of stuff's been said in the past, and so I think we just got to be sensible and see how it all plays out.
Well, I mean, I think Peter Dutton was quite clear that the coalition would be supporting the ambassador in the United States, regardless of who it was, because it was Australia's judgment to make as to who would send it to Washington, not someone else's.
Yes, that's right. We will decide who we send to Washington, and no one else. Indeed.
That's right. That's a very important principle. So, how do you think we are perceived in DC as a country? Are we perceived as as often appears on all the paraphernalia, the mateship thing, and all that? We're seen as a very close friend.
I mean, we did a survey when I was ambassador of opinion makers in Washington, and I think their main perception of the relationship was that it was relatively trouble free. That we sort of had each other's back, we sort of get each other. Um, there was a perception that we were very focused on resources and the resources trade. They perhaps didn't understand the full extent of which of what we do in science and tech and services and whatever. And I saw that as a bit of a challenge to help Americans understand how diverse the Australian economy is becoming. Needs to be more diverse, but it's becoming more diverse. Um, I think there was a view that because of the high regard in which we're held, we have more clout than we perhaps imagine, and that we should therefore be willing to use that clout. That doesn't mean uh, disagreeing or attacking the US in public necessarily. You can be a good friend and a good advisor to someone else in private, and maybe that's more effective. Um, yeah, so this cliche that often spoken about, do we punch above our weight? I think we punch above our weight, but there's scope to do more. And I think we're one of the allies and partners that the US recognizes as being consistent in upholding the sort of values that we share around democracy, rule of law, and the like.
So it sounds to me from your analysis that not a whole lot will change in the bilateral, unlike some other countries which would be looking at a radically different worldview now, wouldn't they?
Look, I'd be really surprised if anything changed, and that's because partly goodwill from President Trump himself, but also Australian governments of whatever colour, I think always go their way to try and maintain a strong alliance, and that's certainly true of the coalition in government, and that's been true of Labor. So even though, for example, recently we've been normalizing our relationship with China, we haven't done it at the expense of our strategic settings, i.e., the alliance with the US or AUKUS.
That's right. Now, I need to ask you, what do you most miss about the Senate? You've been gone for a few years, but I know that it was one of your favourite workplaces. So, what do you most miss about the Senate?
I think there was a collegiality in the Senate. I think there was an enjoyment in the committee work. I thought that was really useful, and I think the Senate does a great job of that. There's a great tradition of that. Um, And I just always felt that it was a more deliberative body, that it really lived up to that. Uh, and all the ones who were really ambitious to be prime minister, well, they could sort of play at that in the House and leave the real work of legislation to the um, deliberative voices in the Senate.
Yeah. Well, no doubt you still keep a close eye on your old colleagues, and we
Absolutely. And congratulations to you on everything you're doing. I expect another book.
well, I don't know, they're hard to do sometimes when you've got other things going on, but certainly we miss you in the Senate still, and but it's been terrific to see you go on and play that important role for Australia on the world stage as the ambassador. And so, just why don't you give us a quick update on what you're doing now?
Well, I after I left the ambassadorship, I joined the Asia Group here in DC. It was co-founded by Kurt Campbell, who's Deputy Secretary of State now. It helps companies navigate doing business in Asia, understanding the policy, the regulatory frameworks, the geopolitics of different markets. We've got offices through the region: Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo, Taipei, Thailand, India, partnership developing in Indonesia. I've set up an Australia practice, and we've appointed a country director, Beck Shrimpton, who was at ASPI. And yeah, and there's about 4 or 5 working on the Australia practice now, defence and national security, and also digital stuff. So plenty on. It's a mixture of, I suppose, politics and economics. So it draws on areas I've worked on before. And when you're ready to come over, Braggy, we'll make you a partner, and you can weave your magic at Asia Group.
Well, that will be hopefully sometime in the future because I'm planning to
Some way down the track.
plan to get this election out of the way first. But Arthur, it's been a great pleasure to have you on the yarn. Thank you very much for all you have done and what you continue to do for Australia. And thanks for your time today.
Thanks, mate. Always great to see you.
Thanks, mate.